and welcome to the SEP Podcast. I am your host, Brother Drew Austin. I'm the historian of the Southeast Province. One of the special media projects that we're working on this year is bringing back our SEP Podcast. From what I understand, this will be our first episode in about 3 years, I believe. And I think this is episode 3. I'll do some extra research afterwards, and if I need to change that, well, that'll be in the title card. But for right now, this is episode 3. And we have a very special guest all the way from our Iota chapter. We have Brother Kaylee Simon. Hey, Brother Kaylee.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
Ready for graduation.
I know, I can imagine.
So Brother Kaylee has a very special topic for us to discuss today. And what's the topic, Brother Kaylee?
It's social determinants of health.
All right, awesome. So for our audience members who may not be familiar with that topic, what exactly are social determinants of health and why are they important?
Yeah, so social determinants of health, so there are conditions or environments where people either are born into, live, learn, work, play, anything that would, a wide range of things that would affect your health or your functioning or your daily life. So whether that's like food insecurity, maybe you don't have access to housing or transportation, or your employment status, education level, your neighborhood, or as well as any like disabilities or like any functioning issues that a person has. So it's basically any condition or environment that a person lives in or is born in that can affect their quality of life.
Okay, so like I come from, you can probably tell from the country accent, but I do come from a rural small town. And from what I understand, we're considered like medically underserved because, we don't have the access to like the big, more, I guess, high-tech hospitals. A lot of our community is in low income and unfortunately poverty. So does that tie into social determinants of health then? Like our situation of our being a medically underserved community or?
Right, exactly. So specifically within like healthcare, it's somebody's inability to access, like you said, it might be in a rural area where they can't access, healthcare. It might be the most closest hospital is 20, 30, 40 minutes, an hour away. So anything that affects like your ability to get access to healthcare. And I think that's super important for us as like future pharmacists is to how do we get these rural populations access to healthcare, because we want to make sure everyone has adequate access to healthcare, but how can we as healthcare professionals get these, get the care out to these people? And I think now with like telehealth, that's given us a lot of opportunities to go out to these places who might not usually have access to care.
Okay, yeah. Because I know like in my hometown situation, like you were saying, it can be, sometimes 10, 15 miles before you get to town. And the closest healthcare provider or the healthcare professional is basically the local town pharmacist. So can pharmacists play a big role as far as helping people overcome any problems related to this issue or?
Yeah, definitely. Because as you said, pharmacists are kind of the first people that a lot of the first person these people see. And I think the biggest thing is when these people end up in the emergency room, they end up like dying or they end up paying a huge hospital bill because they're really sick. So we're really trying to prevent, them going to the emergency room. And the first person would be that pharmacist, oh, you see that this person like they're picking up a medicine and they're like maybe feeling dizzy or they look kind of weird, maybe saying, hey, like let me maybe their blood pressure is super low and they just need like to be they need water or something. Just kind of checking them out and encouraging them to go to that primary care physician, because a lot of these people who don't have access, they wait till they're super sick and then they go to the hospital, and then instead of preventing something that, was originally just, oh, your blood pressure was a little low, you might need to like just eat a cracker or something. But instead they wait till their blood pressure is super low and then they end up in the emergency room and then, bad things happen. So the pharmacist role really is in these communities to, be that safe haven. So people, a lot of the issue too with some of these communities, especially, minority communities, they don't necessarily trust the doctors or they don't want to go to the doctor. So if you just have that like open, welcoming, feeling as the pharmacist, then you might get some of these patients to actually go to their doctor and prevent them from having long-term health issues.
Okay, and that is a good point though. So like, is there a reason there's a distrust toward the physicians, or is it only physicians, or is it other healthcare professionals too, or?
Yeah, so there's actually a huge history of like mistrust, especially with like people of color and minority populations, just with a lot of like the old clinical trials and the studies. I don't know if you've heard of like the Tuskegee study or like the Henrietta Lacks situation. There was the Tuskegee was about men who were denied treatment of penicillin.
Mhm.
So they basically these people weren't given adequate treatment, so they ended up dying from syphilis because they weren't given adequate treatment. And so
Mhm.
that's one of the studies where a lot of people of color were like, well, look at what happened in the past. Like we weren't given adequate healthcare, like you let these men suffer. So there's a lot of historical mistrust, so that goes passed down to generations. And actually at our school, they're trying to get a social determinants of health course. And so they did, I participated in like there was like a trial for the course to see
Mhm.
if we can kind of have students interested. And one of the social workers said she had a few patients where the Tuskegee trial was one of the reasons why like they didn't want to get healthcare, they didn't want to like get vaccines, and they literally were like quoting the study even though it was like years ago. It was in like 1930s or something, but people are still talking about it
Right.
because it gets passed down through generations.
So I guess in that case, it is important to be aware of, the unfortunately unethical stuff or the unethical side of like the early 19th, 18th, 19th, 20th century medicine, because it still has repercussions up to today, right? So that's why one reason to, people. So from what I understand is like people in minority communities, they see like the terrible things that happen to, their ancestors, and they still have a lot of, maybe resentment and mistrust toward the medical community, right?
Right, exactly. And I think that's kind of our jobs now is, educating ourselves on not just pharmacy, like the
Mhm.
medications and stuff, but also like the culture around people. And, most people aren't gonna, when they come to you, they're not gonna say, oh, yeah, like, I'm really like, don't trust you. I'm struggling financially. Like, I can't even get to my appointments. They're not gonna like straight up tell you that. So it's kind of important to when you talk to them, not say, "Oh, well, why don't you come? Why don't you pick up your medicine? Or why don't you go to see your doctor? Like, what's wrong with you?" But like trying to encourage them, "Hey, you have like really high blood pressure. We don't want you to end up in the hospital and having to pay like a huge hospital bill. Like, what can I do to help you?" And there's so many resources out there, whether it's for like transportation or food, but a lot of people don't know about them. And I think one thing from doing that trial course is they had us go to clinics and we got to see like what social workers do, but also like the physicians and stuff. But actually seeing like the social worker's role after like the patient gets discharged, I think is super important because in pharmacy school, we just learn like the process. Okay, the patient comes in, the doctor puts in an order, we like verify the order, and then the drug gets to the patient, and then the patient gets discharged. But we don't really see like, okay, well, what happens after like the patient gets discharged? What goes on? Like the patient was sick and now they're going home. And the importance of the social worker is they work with that patient. Okay, they know all the resources. They know where the patient needs to go if they don't have food or they don't have transportation. I think a lot of times when we're in like the healthcare position, we're like, okay, we're going to treat them, then send them home. But we
Mhm.
don't realize that, they might not come see you at their next visit because they don't have access to a car or they don't have a bus stop nearby. And you don't really think of this stuff. You just expect, oh yeah, I'll see you in 6 months for your next appointment. And so I think as our role in healthcare, we need to kind of ask the questions, but don't ask it in a way you're sound like it's the patient's fault. But just try to, 70% of healthcare is actually not like the healthcare side of it, it's the social aspect of it, social
Mhm.
economic. And I think we think, oh, our job is just here, we're going to help their health. Like, oh, they have high blood pressure, they have, high cholesterol, I want to treat that. But I think a lot of times it's, well, why do they have high blood pressure? Maybe they're in a community where food is really big and they only eat like fried food. I think a lot of times we don't ask the underlying like religion or like culture backgrounds or like the social determinants of health issues that a patient might have. We just see them as like a patient and they have these medical issues.
So I guess we kind of need to take into account we're treating a person, an actual human who's more than just the biological and chemical. You got the social, psychological, spiritual, mental. So what it would be like one way a pharmacist, like in particular, or especially for our new, we got a lot of new fixing to be graduating brothers. What could they possibly do as far as in their new roles as being, pharmacists to help out with these issues, to help kind of, you know, extend that trust, build that trust, and I guess get comfortable enough that you can connect with the patients and be like, hey, maybe we can point you in the direction of sources or resources you need for help. So what would be one way we could, start that conversation?
Right. I think it's definitely that motivational interviewing. They always tell us, like, oh, you have to ask these certain questions, make sure they're open ended. And I think that's like good start to ask those important questions. But then, as we were saying before, like, look beyond your patient's clinical or medical history. Look, does the patient have a history of not showing up, or the patient has a history of not picking up their meds at the pharmacy? So kind of seeing the different, if you see a patient that's had specific issues, maybe it's related to the fact that, they don't speak English and they can't, go to the pharmacy, or they don't have a car and they can't pick up their meds. And then also just educating yourself on like specific barriers. If you know you're working in a specific, area or specific population, how can you educate yourself about that population? What are their barriers to healthcare? And then just exposing yourself to different cultures or races, or just getting that exposure so you can understand what that person's going through and maybe their distrust. And then just, reflecting on yourself and how are you. I think a bias is a huge thing as well. I think we all know that there's like implicit bias, but we might not self-reflect or examine that bias. So I think that's also a good thing that we as future healthcare workers can examine and reflect on as well.
Okay. So like one thing, I guess one way I guess I've tried to do this, like in my community, we do have a lot of migrant workers who their main language is Spanish. Granted, I'm not an expert in Spanish, but I have been diligently working on having, enough of a working knowledge of Spanish that I can, properly and effectively communicate with my patients who can only speak Spanish. So that's one way that I can continue to work on doing that, right?
Right, exactly. And I think people don't understand sometimes just introducing yourself in that language, like, that goes a long way. So, like, you might not understand everything, but they at least know that you're trying, and I think that's huge, and great job for,
So that's
learning.
one way that's one way to help establish the trust and help to build that trust up, right?
Right, exactly. And I think also biggest thing is like culture as well. I think when we think of medicine, we're like, oh, the patient's just gonna like take this medicine because we recommended. But there's actually like some religions that they may not be able to take that medicine, or like, some cultural issue where what you're prescribing they can't take. So instead of blaming somebody, oh, well, why aren't you taking this medicine? As I said before, well, maybe see, it might be something like about like their culture. And I think that goes with building that relationship with that patient so they feel comfortable enough telling you those things. And as we said before, not just seeing them as somebody's that's coming to see you and they have these problems, but actually a human being, that they have culture, they have religion, they have a family. So kind of seeing the whole picture.
'Cause I know in my hometown we do have, and again, my hometown is, predominantly is more on the conservative Christian side, but that, sometimes the viewpoints are like, okay, there's hesitations toward vaccines, or there may be hesitations toward more like the mRNA or maybe medicine that's involved with the biologics, because there's, it's associated with genetic engineering, which, there's concern or worry about. So that could kind of be an issue that I might have to deal with in the future. So, like, if, say, for instance, if I have a patient who is from an environment or from a background he's hesitant about vaccines, what would be like a way I could kind of start a conversation with them? Because I know I may not be able to convince them, and in the first conversation that, hey, you might need to get vaccinated, but how could I, like, start that conversation? What would you suggest in that?
Yeah, I think it's always everyone has their thought process and everyone has their beliefs. So you want to make sure that you're not saying, "Oh, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong." And I think first starting the question, well, why do you think that? Where did you get that information from? And not being like, "Okay, well, I totally disagree with you. That's false." But maybe they got it from their grandparents and that's just like an old wise tale, or maybe they actually did like find some, research online, but it was just from Wikipedia, and then now you can educate them. Yeah, well, Wikipedia might not be the best source, and here's a few articles that like you can read on, maybe there's a different perspective. So I think asking them their why is super important because you want to make them feel comfortable. So ask them their why, like, where'd you get this information? Why do you think that? And then if the patient's like really interested or has a really strong belief, then you can say, hey, well, I totally understand where you're coming from, but I've seen like this study on PubMed that, might have a
Mhm.
different view as you. So giving them also like those resources to be like, here, if you want to read like what I'm saying, this is, a resource. Because I think a lot of times people think that, we're healthcare workers and we're just going to say whatever, here's the medicine or here's the vaccine, we're going to say it works. But if you actually like back up what you're saying with some proof and have them like look at it, then that also will build their trust, because they're like saying, hey, I'm not just saying this to say it, I have like some proof and you
Mhm.
can read it. That way the person can then decide, okay, I have my beliefs from my grandma who told me this, for
Mhm.
the past 20 years, but I also have like this one article that I can look at too. So I think it's the two biggest things are asking their why, where did they get the information from, and then also providing them with resources on, this is why, the we've had the vaccines and they help with certain diseases. We've eradicated a bunch of diseases, and without these vaccines, a lot more people would have died. So showing them like the facts and giving them the option then to make their decision.
Right. So it's kind of like we don't need to just even if they are, I know wrong is all wrong. There's a lot of definition on what's right and wrong, but even if, we believe that they're wrong, we just don't need to spurn them or cast them out. We need to kind of understand where they're coming from. And then eventually we might be able to maybe not change their mind, but at least get them to, understand or be more receptive to toward the information, right?
Right, exactly. And some people are stubborn and they're not going to change their mind, but just, get that ball rolling in their head. Oh yeah, maybe there is something, different that I could, find some belief in. So, I think just getting that ball rolling in their head. And I think the biggest thing as healthcare workers, we always, we want to feel like we can help people. We want to do good for somebody, but not every patient's going to be receptive to that, and that's okay. You didn't do a bad job. You're not a bad healthcare worker. It's just not everyone's, going to be receptive to the way you talk to somebody, or, it's okay. They'll go find a different healthcare provider. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. Like, we're not going to have good relationships with every patient because we all have different communication styles. But as long as, you do your best to provide them with those resources, and then they can make that decision.
Okay, very cool. Now this question is if you're comfortable answering it, but so why is the social or the concept of social determinants of health so important to you though? Was there like a certain reason that it became an important issue to you or
Yeah, so I have my grandma is Mexican, so I have like that Hispanic background, like
Mhm.
minority background. And I think a lot of times when it comes to minorities in healthcare, I have a passion for it because there's a lot of mistreatment. And I think I've seen that also in like the African American population, especially with like women and pregnancy. I've seen a lot of like the mortality rate for African American women is a lot higher than any other race. And I also did a through the Emory Global Health Institute, there was a case competition and we focused on maternal mortality. And so I think it's very interesting to me because I think a lot of these topics, people are like, "Oh, we're in the United States, like these things don't happen." But then when you look deeper, like actually there is still like issues.
Mhm.
And I think as like healthcare workers, this is something we should definitely, try to break.
Right.
And it's sad that, we still have like
Mhm.
women dying because, there's the whole issue with like pain scales, like, oh, we don't think, this woman's actually in pain, so we're not going to give her, pain meds, and then stuff starts happening. So I think I have passionately just because of like my actual background, but I think also just from what I've seen, experiences from other people, and then doing like global health case
Mhm.
competitions where, you see the statistics and you're like, wow, like, we live in the United States and everyone says this country is so great, but we still have within our healthcare systems a lot of issues that need to be addressed.
Right. Okay, very interesting. Now, I guess we're kind of getting toward the end of the questions, but so if I understand correctly, you recently went to was it the correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but was it the SNAFA regional conference or a national conference?
Yes, yes.
So what is your history with SNAFA, if you're okay with or telling our audience?
Yeah, so I again have a huge passion for SNAFA because it focuses on like minority population. So I was the treasurer this past year.
Very cool.
One of the cool things when I went to that conference is they had an organization there, Shot at Life, and they focused on like childhood vaccinations like globally. And I thought that was really interesting. And I really like that conference because they focused on pharmacy, but they also focused on like the advocacy part. So while we are like healthcare workers and we're trying to help people, we can also like be advocates as well. Even if we're not treating these patients, we can still
Mhm.
have a voice, and so I think that was really cool, a part of that being a part of that conference because they showed you the importance of having a voice, especially in pharmacy, because a lot of times within pharmacy, they tend to knock us down a little bit because we aren't
Right.
physicians, and a lot of times a lot of places we don't have that prescribing power, but just, like, it reassured, "Hey, we do have a voice, and it's our role as healthcare workers to, be a voice for those people who don't have voices."
Okay, very cool, very cool. Okay, now for our last two questions, well, kind of a two-part question. How would you say that being a brother of Kappa Psi has, benefited your growth as a healthcare professional? Was there any particular part of like, whether it was the pledging process or your current process of being because you're still a collegiate brother, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so any process of like your current journey as a collegiate brother that's helped you in becoming a better healthcare professional, or
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is, at least within my pledge class, there was very different personalities, very different like leadership
Mhm.
styles and the way people communicated. And so I think that was super helpful for me to like understand how to, communicate to different people and how to change how you speak to somebody as well. Because the way you talk to one person might not be the same as how you talk to somebody else. So I think that was one of the biggest things I learned is how do you, when you're talking to somebody, figure out, okay, the way I'm coming off is not, the person's not responding. So how do I quickly change my tone or how I'm saying something to like get that person to understand what I'm saying? So I think that was one of the big things. And then I'm the professional relations chair committee this year. And so one of the big things that reasons I like this role is trying to see how we can develop our brothers professionally, but also how at MUSC we have like the College of Medicine, College of Health Professions, like other colleges. So we did a sex trafficking workshop. And so that I was really proud of that workshop because it kind of goes along with like social determinants of health of, you know, situations people are in that you might not necessarily know of. So you might be, an emergency medicine pharmacist and somebody comes in and, it looks like there's a man in the room and you don't really know. It's like a young child and then there's a man in the room, you don't really know that relationship. And I think a lot of times being exposed to certain topics as healthcare professionals is super important, and they don't give you training on, like you don't have a class for social determinants of health, you don't have a class on, like, identifying sex trafficking victims. So if through Kappa Psi we can expose our brothers to, like, all these different topics that aren't just, like, the medicine, I think that will give our brothers opportunities to be well-rounded healthcare professionals, so that way when they do, talk to patients, whether it's through motivational interviewing or just having that relationship, they can figure out how do I ask, difficult questions? How do I talk to this person? How can I communicate based on their, somebody who is doesn't have housing or doesn't have transportation? How can I figure out how to relate to that person or what is their why? Like maybe right now they might have like a UTI and they're in pain, but that's not their priority. Their priority is, their high blood pressure because they're not feeling good and they can't take their kids to school. Like, what is that person's priority? What is their why right now? So I think just being able to expose our brothers to these certain topics that we're not going to be exposed to in the classroom, I
Mhm.
think that has, it's been a really good experience for me. So I'm very grateful for my time in Kappa Psi.
Very cool. That sounds really cool too, because as we mentioned before, you're treating more than just a collection of cells and biochemicals. You're a living
Right.
human being with all kinds of complex feelings. But
Exactly.
yeah, it has been awesome talking to you, brother Kaylee. Is there anything else you want to say to our SCP family though before you head out, or?
I guess I'll end on, I think just as we talked about, if you guys take away anything is, being able to motivationally interview somebody, but don't think of it as an interview. Think about you're building that connection with somebody, knowing which questions to ask, and then understanding how you say it is super important. And then having a bigger picture of this person. Everyone has stress, everyone is going through something, and see how does that play a role in their healthcare? Because as I said before, most of healthcare is socioeconomic things besides just, the medicine, what medicine they're on. So just making sure as, going into a healthcare professional, we do our best to relate to our patients and give them the best care that we can.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brother Kaylee. You are definitely a superstar of the SCP. Yes. We appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule because you just started rotations, right?
I'm going to be a P3, so I'm on my summer rotation.
Okay, summer rotation. Hey, rotation's still rotations, but
Yes,
we
exactly.
definitely appreciate you taking time out of the schedule.
Yes,
It was a very interesting topic too.
Yes, thank you for having me.
All right, so that's a wrap for our again, I think it's episode 3. If it's actually episode 4, I'll correct it in the title card. But our first episode back in quite a while. We hope you enjoyed this, and our goal is to hopefully, if not have a podcast episode every month, at least to be, bi-monthly. So we're hoping this can be a platform where brothers like Brother Kaylee just did an awesome job of sharing topics that they're passionate about, that they care about, and also just getting a chance to spotlight our brothers. Because let's face it, our SCP brothers are amazing. And we just want to celebrate them the best we can. So, everybody, take care of yourself. Stay safe. And bye-bye.